Hello, I'm Dilek Tuna and you're watching A News. Now let's take a look at today's top stories. The US 28-point plan to end the war in Ukraine is raising concerns in Ukraine and Europe. US President Donald Trump signs a bill that orders the release of the Epstein files. And Turkey will host next year's UN Climate Summit, while Australia will lead the conference's negotiations among governments. The United States has put forward a new peace proposal for Ukraine, one that would require Kyiv to give up more territory in the east in exchange for long-term American security guarantees. The plan, backed by President Trump, is drawing strong reactions from Europe and Kyiv.
A new US proposal backed by President Donald Trump would require Ukraine to cede additional eastern territory in exchange for long-term American security guarantees, a move Washington says is intended to prevent Russia from restarting the war. Sources say the 28-point plan grants Russia full de facto control over all of Luhansk and Donetsk, including areas still held by Ukraine, while largely freezing current lines in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Withdrawn areas in Donbass would be designated as a demilitarized zone. Ukraine would not be asked to recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea or Donbass, though the US and several partners would. Ukrainian officials say the plan also limits the size of Ukraine's armed forces and long-range weapons, conditions they call unacceptable. According to sources, Zelensky's national security advisor Rustem Umerov held direct talks with Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff. US officials, however, claim Zelensky later walked back from those understandings and is now pursuing a separate plan with European partners.
What we as Europeans have always supported is a long-lasting and just peace, and we welcome any efforts to achieve that. Of course, for any plan to work, it needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board, so this is very clear.
In Kyiv, residents also rejected the idea of territorial concessions.
I do not consider these conditions acceptable, even if leaders agree. People and the military will never accept it.
I do not think Zelensky will sign such terms. He knows it would be unpopular, and he is patriotic enough not to do it.
These conditions are not acceptable. Ukraine should return to the borders of 1991.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on social media that Washington is preparing serious and realistic ideas, insisting that any lasting peace will require difficult concessions from both sides.
European foreign ministers meeting in Brussels on Thursday said any plan to end the war in Ukraine must fully include both Kyiv and EU partners. During the meeting, the ministers also discussed the peace in the Middle East and other global challenges. Earlier, Reuters reported that the United States has signalled to President Volodymyr Zelensky that Ukraine should accept a US-drafted peace framework. That proposal would require Kyiv to give up some territory, reduce certain weapons, and limit the size of its army. Such concessions would be a major blow for Ukraine. The White House has declined to comment on the reported proposal. Ukraine has been hit by one of the largest Russian aerial attacks in months, striking multiple regions and causing heavy casualties, while US and Russian officials have quietly drafted a new plan to end the war in Ukraine. But it would require Kyiv to surrender territory and severely limit the size of its military. Here's more on that story.
At least 26 people have been killed in a major Russian missile and drone attack on the western Ukrainian city of Ternopil, according to officials. The upper floors of a residential building were torn away, and debris and personal belongings were scattered across the area as thick smoke rose over the city. More than 90 people were wounded.
As you can hear, the equipment ceased its operation. A moment of silence has been declared to be able to hear possible survivors under the rubble. Around 30 minutes ago, we made contact with a young person in their 20s. The rescuers keep constant contact with him.
The military says X-101 cruise missiles hit the residential block in Ternopil, which is a city close to the Polish border that has rarely been targeted.
My son is still in the apartment on the 9th floor. I talked to him before the explosions. That's it. He said, "Mum, everything will be fine. Don't worry." After this, I tried calling and couldn't reach him. I know nothing.
Ukraine says Russia fired 476 drones and 48 missiles overnight, hitting energy and transport sites and forcing emergency power cuts during freezing temperatures. Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk regions were also struck, while drone attacks in Kharkiv injured more than 30 people, setting buildings and cars on fire. Ukraine's Air Force reports shooting down 442 drones and 41 missiles, including 10 intercepted by F-16 and Mirage 2000 jets provided by Western allies. Russia's defense ministry says it carried out a massive strike using long-range precision weapons, claiming it targeted Ukraine's military industry and energy sector. It says it's in response to Ukrainian attacks on civilian sites inside Russia. The attacks come as President Volodymyr Zelensky travelled to Turkey for talks aimed at reviving peace negotiations. He urged Kiev's allies to increase pressure on Moscow and provide more air defence missiles. A high-level US military delegation led by Army Secretary Dan Driscoll arrived in Ukraine to discuss efforts to end the war. The team is expected to meet Zelensky in Kiev after his return from Turkey. Ukrainian officials said the delegation was briefed on Russia's troop build-up, ongoing offensives and recent attacks on civilian areas.
Britain is issuing a sharp warning to Moscow after a Russian spy ship used lasers to disrupt Royal Air Force pilots monitoring its movements near UK waters. Defence Secretary John Healey says the action by the vessel known as the Yanta was deeply dangerous and is being treated with the highest concern.
As I speak, a Russian spy ship, the Yantar, is on the edge of UK waters north of Scotland, having entered the UK's wider waters over the last few weeks. This is a vessel designed for gathering intelligence and mapping our undersea cables. We deployed a Royal Navy frigate and RAF P-8 planes to monitor and track this vessel's every move, during which the Yantar directed lasers at our pilots. That Russian action is deeply dangerous. And this is the second time this year that this ship, the Yantar, has deployed to UK waters. So my message to Russia and to Putin is this. We see you, we know what you're doing, and if the Yantar travels south this week, we are ready.
Thursday marks 80 years since the opening of the Nuremberg trials, the landmark proceedings that first held Nazi leaders personally accountable for crimes committed during the Second World War. The tribunal would go on to define the principles of modern international justice and shape the courts we know today. Here's a look back at the moment that changed global law.
Nearly 80 years ago, on the 20th of November in 1945, the world witnessed a moment that reshaped international justice. In a Germany still in ruins after the Second World War, judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union gathered in the city of Nuremberg. They opened the first ever international military tribunal, a court created to put the surviving leaders of Nazi Germany on trial. For the first time in history, top political, military and administrative officials were held personally accountable for crimes committed by a state. 22 of the most senior Nazi figures were brought before the tribunal, charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity and conspiracy. 12 would eventually be sentenced to death. 3 were acquitted, the rest received long prison terms. Hermann Göring, once one of Hitler's most powerful deputies, was convicted but died by suicide just hours before his execution in October 1946. The Nuremberg process continued beyond the first tribunal. Between 1946 and 1949, the United States held 12 additional trials, prosecuting 177 Nazi officials, from SS commanders and generals to doctors and industrialists. In total, 199 people were tried in Nuremberg, 161 were convicted, and 37 were sentenced to death. Nuremberg became the blueprint for modern international justice, the ancestor of today's tribunals and the International Criminal Court. And although some of the major perpetrators never stood trial, the proceedings mark the first time the world said, collectively, that such crimes would not go unanswered.
President Donald Trump has signed the bill that directs the Department of Justice to publicly release all its Jeffrey Epstein-related files. The move is expected to shed more light on the late sex offender's activities and connections to prominent figures.
All files related to a long-running investigation into late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein are set to be released. US President Donald Trump signed legislation on Wednesday ordering the Department of Justice to release the documents. In a post on his Truth Social platform, Trump framed the move as a transparency measure and used the moment to criticize Democrats over their alleged past connections to Epstein. The scandal has been a thorn in Trump's side for months, as he previously resisted calls for full disclosure. But he shifted his position after mounting pressure from Epstein's victims and from within the Republican Party. He's always denied any wrongdoing. However, the material could shed more light on the activities of Epstein. Before his 2008 conviction on charges of soliciting a minor for prostitution, he died in jail in 2019 while facing federal sex trafficking charges. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the Justice Department will protect victims' privacy, so some details may be withheld, such as sensitive information for ongoing investigations. The bill, known as the Epstein Files Transparency Act, passed the House with a 427-1 vote and cleared the Senate by unanimous consent on Tuesday. The documents must be made public in a searchable format within 30 days.
Tensions in Gaza are rising again as fresh Israeli airstrikes and conflicting accounts from both sides cast new doubt on the stability of the month-old ceasefire. 10 people, including a woman and a young girl, were killed in Gaza, according to rescuers. The Israeli military said it had struck Hamas terrorist targets after it said gunmen had opened fire towards an area where its soldiers were operating in the southern city of Khan Yunis.
4 Israeli airstrikes across Gaza on Wednesday killed at least 25 people, according to local health authorities. It marked one of the most serious escalations since last month's US-brokered ceasefire. The heaviest casualties were reported in Gaza City's Zaytun neighborhood, where a religious endowments ministry building was hit, which killed 10 people. Additional strikes hit Shujaiya, Khan Yunis and the Mawasi area. Israeli military said it targeted Hamas positions after gunmen opened fire on its troops in Khan Yunis, killing 3 of its soldiers, calling the incident a breach of the ceasefire. Hamas dismissed Israelis' account and described the strikes as a dangerous escalation, urging Washington to pressure Tel Aviv to halt its attacks. Wednesday's violence follows 2 earlier flare-ups in October, though the ceasefire remains officially in place. The latest incident comes shortly after the United Nations Security Council endorsed US President Donald Trump's plan for the Strip's political transition and reconstruction. Gaza's health ministry says 280 people have been killed during this ceasefire.
An Israeli strike on Wednesday rocked Tyre Filsei in southern Lebanon, killing at least 1 person and prompting residents to flee several villages after warnings of further attacks. The Israeli military said it targeted Hezbollah militants, while attacks on Deir Kifa, Chehud, Ain Nata and Tyre Filsei sent plumes of smoke into the air. On Tuesday, an Israeli strike in the Ain al-Hilweh Palestinian refugee camp near Sidon killed 13 people. Australia and Turkey have reached a compromise over who will host and lead next year's major UN climate summit. Turkey will stage COP31, but Australia will take charge of the negotiations. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese confirmed the arrangement.
Turkey is set to host next year's UN climate summit, while Australia will lead negotiations under a compromise reached during talks in Brazil. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese confirmed the deal before leaving for the G20 summit in Perth.
Beautiful Perth day. So we consulted our Pacific neighbours. I spoke with Prime Minister Marape. I spoke with Prime Minister Rambuka of Fiji. And what we did, we've come up with an outstanding result. COP31 will be hosted by Turkey. Turkey will have the COP presidency, but Chris Bowen in Australia will have the COP presidency for negotiations.
As part of the arrangement, a pre-COP meeting will be held in the Pacific, with the location still to be decided. Australia has framed its role as a Pacific COP, calling attention to the climate threats facing low-lying island states. Albanese said the deal supports regional priorities and ensures the summit does not shift to Bonn, Germany.
We're in a position where it either went to Bonn in Germany or went to Turkey. Our priority was to support the multilateral system, but also to get a good result for Australia and the Pacific.
The agreement ends a 2-year standoff after both Turkey and Australia submitted rival bids in 2022 and declined to step aside.
As the climate summit in Belém nears its end, Brazil is pushing for progress on the most divisive issues. Negotiators met President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva on Wednesday to bridge gaps in climate goals and advance implementation plans.
Brazil is pushing to wrap up the COP30 summit on time as the meeting enters its final stretch on Friday, a departure from recent climate talks that dragged past deadline. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva met negotiators on Wednesday in a bid to secure early agreements on the thorniest issues, including fossil fuels and climate finance. Brazil is promoting its Tropical Forests Forever facility, a multilateral fund aimed at raising $25 billion in public and philanthropic money to attract another $100 billion in private investment for protecting endangered forests. The president has expressed confidence in the outcome of the talks.
I leave to Brasilia certain that my negotiators will achieve the best result that a COP can ever offer to planet Earth.
Brazilian officials say Germany plans to contribute €1 billion to the fund. Another major point of contention is a fossil fuel roadmap designed to outline how countries will accelerate the shift away from oil, gas and coal.
And so this idea of a roadmap is something that actually has been discussed for ever since. But we, I think, finally now have a political moment where it's been raised to that level of consciousness where everybody realizes that it's something that really has to be in this text. Again, it's one of those things. Will it land? We're going to have to fight tooth and nail. There are many parties who have already said that they do not want that in the text at all.
Nearly 200 countries are attending the 2-week UN summit in Belém, though the United States, the world's top historic emitter, is absent. Brazil hoped to approve a package of agreements on Wednesday and finalise remaining issues on Friday, but delays have already hit the release of new negotiating texts.
Now we'll take a short break. When we return, we will discuss what Zelensky's talks in Turkey actually produced and how the EU foreign ministers meeting in Brussels fits into the broader effort to keep both the diplomatic and support tracks for Ukraine alive. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has held talks in Turkey as part of an effort to revive the Istanbul peace track. an earlier framework that brought Russian and Ukrainian negotiators to the same table. The visit comes as European Union foreign ministers meet in Brussels to also discuss continued support for Kyiv against the backdrop of budget pressures and ongoing debates over the scale of future military and financial assistance. Joining me now to unpack is Alexandra Filipenko. She's a political analyst from Vilnius, Lithuania. Alexandra, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now let's start with Zelensky's visit to Turkey. What were the key outcomes from his talks there, particularly in terms of any concrete steps toward reviving the Istanbul peace plan or process?
That's the most important issue, the concrete details. We don't know if there is right now a possibility to jumpstart the new wave of negotiations, because we understand that Turkey has been critical for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And it's been not only a place of negotiation, but it's also been a great help to the negotiating parties. And if it's a realistic revival, we will learn fairly soon. But what we understand is that there is no major outcome regarding Ukraine and United States talks, because the meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Steve Witkoff, the representative of President Trump, was canceled because we learned more and more about that peace plan, or about Witkoff plan regarding the ending of the war in Ukraine, or as the Russian side that really applauded the plan calls it, the conflict in Ukraine. So Ukraine wants to reposition the pressure on Russia, and although President Zelensky during his meetings in Turkey repeated many times that Ukraine applauds all efforts and efforts of the United States also to end the war, we understand that right now the pressure is mainly on Ukraine, mainly on Zelensky, especially due to those sources that were quoted by multiple American newspapers, quoting the ideas from that peace plan, that secret peace plan. So it was very difficult for Zelensky to keep his track in Turkey.
Okay, and Alexandra, Turkey has previously hosted talks and helped broker grain and prisoner exchange agreements. Does Ankara still have the leverage and credibility needed to act as a meaningful mediator?
Right now, we see the exchange, at least the exchange of military exchanges between Ukraine and Russia, the exchange of bodies, the exchange of prisoners, prisoners of war between Russia and Ukraine, only happening through Turkey and through the help, through their help. So they, of course, remain a major party to that negotiation, and we understand that Zelensky would like to see Turkey as that negotiator, because we've heard about Qatar being part of that peace plan, being part to that 28-point peace plan, and this is not what Ukraine would like to see. Zelensky definitely would rather see Erdogan being a part of that negotiation, so they will try to promote this idea rather than anyone else. Even, for example, what the meetings in Budapest were supposed to happen, and Viktor Orban was supposed to be the main negotiator. That is not what the Ukrainian side would like to see.
Okay, and from Kyiv's perspective, is this outreach to Turkey mainly about keeping diplomatic channels open, or does it reflect a genuine belief that a negotiated track may become necessary alongside the military front?
Definitely, there's a hope for the negotiation track, because the stalled diplomatic talks between Ukraine and Russia, any success that we saw was actually coming out from Turkey, and they are positioning themselves as the mediator for such diplomacy. And Turkey is ready to discuss any proposals that could accelerate the ceasefire and would really bring everyone to just and lasting peace, if we quote President Zelensky and President Trump. It's important to note that Russia said it would not send representatives to Turkey for talks as of now. They said that they are not ready to send any representatives, although, as we understand, Putin was ready to go and meet at least with President Trump in Budapest. And prior to that, Marco Rubio, the state secretary, was supposed to meet Sergei Lavrov in Budapest, while President Zelensky said that he's ready to go anywhere for any kind of negotiations. Right now, Russia doesn't want to go to Turkey, so most probably this would require a push from the Ukrainian side and from the European side, and Turkey seems to be a perfect place to negotiate because it seems to be in the middle, in between of all the parties.
Okay. And Alexandra, in light of the recent talks, the US military said that Pentagon officials arrived in Ukraine to discuss efforts to end the war with Russia. In your opinion, are we witnessing a genuine push toward peace there?
It's extremely important what we're seeing. This is one of the tracks, because right now we see 3 tracks. The first one is that secret 28-point peace plan that we don't know that much much about. Also, the pressure of the tough sanctions and the legislation that Senator Lindsey Graham talked about. And the third one is the Pentagon diplomacy. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll is not only a very important individual in the Pentagon, he's also a close personal friend of Vice President J.D. Vance. So the fact that Driscoll is in Ukraine right now, it again puts a light on what is happening in Ukraine. And he is there together with 3 4-star generals that are on basically a fact-finding mission, I would put it this way, because they need to realize what is actually happening on the front. Of course, the Russian side is saying that military success is on their side, but those 4-star generals and the Army Secretary and a close personal friend of Vice President J.D. Vance are supposed to see the facts. So this Pentagon mission, let's say, is extremely important right now, exactly in order to understand what's the situation on the ground, and stemming from there, really go somewhere and decide what other track to push, let's say, either that secret peace plan or maybe the pressure on Russia. So this is very important that the Pentagon officials are in Kyiv, are in Ukraine right now. Most probably they will be on the front lines. And maybe we will see that mission going next to Russia.
Okay, so as far as we know, the 28-point plan in many ways mirrors Russian demands after the Putin-Trump meeting in Anchorage. How acceptable is the latest peace proposal for Ukraine?
Of course, it's a non-starter. For Ukraine, this peace plan is not, they don't see it as a U.S. peace plan. They see it as Steve Witkoff peace plan. And everything points to the fact that it might be even Kirill Dmitriev's peace plan. And I would like to quote Marco Rubio, State Secretary Marco Rubio. He posted a really small, tiny bit on his Twitter, on his X page. Ending a complex and deadly war, such as the one in Ukraine, requires an extensive exchange of serious and realistic ideas. And achieving a durable peace will require both sides to agree to difficult but necessary concessions. And what I believe is extremely important. That is why we are and will continue to develop a list of potential ideas for ending this war based on input from both sides on this conflict. So he's saying, basically, the State Secretary is saying that they continue to develop a list of potential ideas. Not that this 28-point plan is exactly how it is and it's exactly how Ukraine must act. No. The State Secretary is saying they are working on it because the State Secretary knows there are so many non-starters in that plan. And that plan is basically a copy of the Russian peace plan that we saw, Russian plan to end the war or end the special military operation, as the Russian side calls it, that we saw in Istanbul previously. And that was deemed and was called a non-starter by the Ukrainian side.
Okay. And Alexandra, how do Ukraine's domestic politics shape Zelensky's room for maneuver here? Is there any space for him to publicly discuss compromises, or does he need to frame this visit strictly as strengthening Ukraine's position?
Not much room for Zelensky to somehow really move on the backdrop of the scandals that are happening inside Ukraine. Of course, it's very damaging, and I suppose it's not a fact, but it seems that it's only logical for the Russian side to push for a peace plan, for the Russian peace plan right now, because as of now, when things are very difficult inside Ukraine, in Ukrainian politics, of course, it's perfect timing to push Ukraine and to push Zelensky and to gain ground, politically gain ground in Europe and in the United States for the Russian side and for Russian representatives. So for Volodymyr Zelensky, it's extremely important to hold the line while he cannot do it inside the country. It's important to hold the line on the outside of Ukraine. And the situation is, of course, very difficult inside the country. And that doesn't allow Zelensky really to negotiate that much, because he talked about red lines. He sees those red lines and he knows what the Ukrainian people want. And one of the things that the Ukrainian people want is, of course, no corruption inside the country, especially when the country is at war. So Zelensky has to right now face both fronts, real military front and the front inside the country.
Okay, Alexandra, we're actually running very short of time. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your insight and your contribution there.
Thank you very much.
We'll take a short break now, and when we return, we'll take a look at key stories shaping the region. Welcome back to A News. Now let's take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. DA Afghanistan Bank is pushing ahead with efforts to modernise the country's financial system. And this week, senior officials have been in Turkey seeking technical support. Our correspondent Tamim Bahis has more from Kabul.
On an official visit to Turkey, the first deputy governor of the Afghanistan Bank, Siddiqullah Khalid, has held high-level talks with the Participation Banks Association of Turkey, known as TKBB. The delegation met with the association's chairman, Ismail Yoral, and other senior members. TKBB is considered a leader in digital banking, credited with supporting the creation of digital banks across Turkey and helping raise online banking usage to some of the highest levels in the region. During the meeting, Mr. Khalid highlighted Afghanistan's shift to a fully Islamic banking system. He said interest-based banking has been halted nationwide, and all commercial banks now operate under Islamic financial contracts. He also emphasized Afghanistan's push toward digital payments, describing it as a crucial step in modernizing the country's financial infrastructure. Kabul is now seeking Turkey's support in building electronic payment systems, strengthening technical capacity, and training Afghan banking staff. Both sides agreed that TKBB will send a technical team to Afghanistan to assess the current state of electronic payments and help evaluate the central bank's newly drafted master plan. They also reached an agreement to establish training programs inside Afghanistan aimed at helping staff adopt more quickly to digital systems. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
The second day of the 9th International Banking Forum continued in Baku, with a focus on fast-moving tech in finance. The agenda covered digital finance, cybersecurity, capital markets, and the wider push toward digital-first services. The discussions brought together officials, financial institutions, fintech teams, and international companies. Sessions highlighted how cashless systems and new payment tools are changing how banks operate. Artificial intelligence and open banking drew strong attention as experts weighed both their promise and the risks. As Caspian Sea, the world's largest inland body of water, is passing through the unprecedented environmental crisis of shrinking, its southern 650-kilometre coastline in Iran is not an exception to the adverse economic and ecological impacts of the decline in water levels. Our Turaj Shiraliliu reports.
This is Caspian Sea from Iran's northern Bandar Anzali port city in Gilan province, the country's historical hub of shipping and transit with Central Asia, Caucasus and Europe, as well as fishery and agricultural activities. Together with Gilan, two Iranian provinces of Mazandaran and Golestan build the 650-kilometer coastline to the south of the sea out of its total 7,000-kilometer coastline. Similar to other littoral states of the Caspian Basin, Iran is experiencing the degrading environmental consequences of severe decline in the world's largest inland body of water. The Caspian Sea reached lowest recorded level at 29.2 meters below sea level in 2024, marking a dramatic 2.3 meter decline since 1996 and representing the most severe water crisis in the sea's documented history. Experts refer to reduced inflows from feeder Volga River, accelerated evaporation, and climate change as factors behind the alarming trend in dramatic decline in water levels. The Caspian Sea countries, including Iran, are facing its existential implications in biodiversity and regional economies, negatively affecting livelihood of millions of people living along its coastline. According to a report by the Stimson Center, a combination of climate and human interventions are the drivers of declining water levels. It cites the rise in temperature, decline in rainfall, increased evaporation, reduced river discharges, together with extensive dam building and river control measures, particularly on the Volga River, severely limiting freshwater deliveries as the factors behind the shrinkage. In the meantime, efforts to address the Caspian catastrophe have remained inconclusive due to geopolitical considerations and competing national interests among the littoral states. The Convention for the Protection of the Marine Environment of the Caspian Sea, signed in 2003 in Tehran and effective since 2006, provides a framework for environmental cooperation, but its implication has not been enough and complete. Restoration of the Caspian Sea ecosystem is not a luxury, but a necessity requiring a strategy built on collective will of its neighboring countries. Turaj Shiraliliu, Bandar Anzali, Gilan Province, for A News.
Turkey has appointed its first ambassador to Damascus after 13 years, restoring full diplomatic representation since its ties with Syria fractured during the civil war. Our correspondent Aliya Iman reports.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan named Deputy Foreign Minister Nuh Yilmaz as Turkey's new ambassador to Syria. According to Anadolu Agency, the appointment caps a gradual normalization process that began when Turkey reopened its embassy in Damascus late last year. The decision, formalized in the official Gazette, marks a symbolic step toward normalization. In a message on X, Yilmaz said the deep cultural bonds between the two nations and pledged to rebuild relations, contributing to regional peace and stability. He also recalled Turkey's support for Syrian civilians in their most difficult days and expressed commitment to reshaping a shared future for Turkish and Syrian civilians. The U.S. ambassador to Turkey, who also serves as U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, called Yilmaz's mission historic, expressing eagerness to work with him. He called the appointment an important step in reshaping regional diplomatic channels. For Turkey, the decision marks a significant step in its Syria policy after years of tensions under Bashar al-Assad. Ankara had to cut formal ties in 2012 as the civil war escalated and backed opposition groups. Now, with an ambassador returning to Damascus, Turkey is ready to engage directly with Syria's post-war future, including cooperation on security, refugees, and regional stability. This is Ali Iman, Istanbul, Turkey, A News.
We'll take a short break now. When we return, we will discuss what the regional meeting in Iran-Rusht actually achieved and what it tells us about how the Caspian states see its cooperation. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. In Iran's Gilan province, the city of Rusht has hosted a meeting focused on strengthening cooperation among the regions of the Caspian littoral states. Official delegations from Azerbaijan, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan and Russia took part in the talks, which looked at ways to deepen economic, transport and environmental collaboration around the Caspian Sea, as well as expanding contacts between coastal regions. Joining me now to unpack is Faramars Farbod. He's an instructor of political science at Moravian University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, United States. Welcome to the program, Faramars.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what were the main themes or outcomes to emerge from this meeting in Rusht, and how significant is it that all 5 Caspian littoral states sent official delegations?
Well, the agenda of this meeting was varied, as you probably know. It included economic agenda, economic cooperation. It included, let's say, work on infrastructure and connectivity issues regarding the North-South corridor. It also, very importantly, as mentioned in your report, included perhaps long-term tackling of the ecological and environmental concerns of the Caspian Sea and Caspian Basin. It included other issues like tourism, maybe monitoring, scientific monitoring of the ecological and sustainability issues, perhaps even educational cooperation. And of course, from the Iran's perspective, it had a strategic value as well, because Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi, in his talk on Tuesday to the general meeting of the summit, he mentioned that the Caspian Sea, from the perspective of Iran, is as strategically important to Iran as is the Persian Gulf. And, you know, part of the attempt that Iran is initiating here is to really create an integrative, cooperative level between the 5 coastal nations surrounding the Caspian Sea on a provincial level, not just merely on the national level. So it's important in all those respects.
Okay, so as you said, it was indeed a packed agenda there, but did we see any concrete announcements on joint projects or mechanisms perhaps, or was it more of a stepping stone meeting to prepare the ground for future agreements?
I think it's, at the moment, one has to say it's more of a preparatory ground, and a lot needs to be done going forward. There are issues that challenges the possibilities of some of these outcomes that, you know, these countries wish for. For instance, you know, instability in the region, political and economic instability could derail these possibilities. Whether or not there will be joint investments in infrastructure and transit and connectivity hubs, we'll have to wait to see. I'm sure there will be at least, you know, accelerated work, I would imagine, on the North-South corridor. And probably the most difficult part of what may come as a plausible outcome is encountering difficulties in balancing economic development concerns with ecological sustainability concerns. Those are not germane to this region, but it's an issue that's really universal. And in order to move towards sustainability, it would require funds, investments, monitoring, and political will.
Okay, and Faramars, the Caspian is central to trade and transit routes. What opportunities are the littoral regions looking at in terms of port development, say shipping and logistics?
Well, I mean, obviously the infrastructure for making this basin into a transit hub and let's say a very important geographical transit and trade requires the kind of investment in shipping, rail, ports, the capacities of the ports. You know, for instance, Anzali port is important from Iran's perspective. The city of Rasht has always been historically called actually a gate to Europe because back in 15th, 16th centuries, it connected Iran to Russia, to the European countries. And Iran now wants to make sure that these kind of rail and road and sea transports connects this region from Europe, Russia, all the way to the not just Caspian Sea, but the Persian Gulf, and to South Asia and West Asia as well, East Asia, if it's possible.
Okay, Friend Myers, we're running short of time now, so unfortunately we're going to have to cut it there. I really appreciate you joining the program. It was most insightful.
Thank you for having me.
You're up to date with world news for the hour. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News.